$2 million. The $1 million grant to Camp Aldersgate in 2014, which provided major funding for its signature multi-purpose facility. And almost every college campus in Arkansas, including UA Little Rock and Philander Smith College, has a Reynolds-funded showcase building. Despite not owning any papers in Little Rock, the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation was very generous to all of us here in Central Arkansas. And about his death in 1993, at the ripe old age of 86, Mr. Reynolds was on a cruise ship bound for Spain, sailing on the Mediterranean Sea. Now that's the way to go out. And that's our Illuminating the Rock story for this week. And now I'd like for Heather Larkin to introduce and moderate today's special program. Heather.
Oh, thank you, Denver. I love your segments. So thank you very much. Good afternoon, Club 99. I too am glad to be with you all on this cold and dreary day. I have to admit, today has not worked out as I had hoped, but I am grateful for the virtual program. I'm glad that you could join us today. Our guest is Eric Nonax. Eric's career path, I'm sure, has provided him with more interesting stories and adventures than he could ever share, especially with us today. From truth commissions to reconciliation work in Ireland and El Salvador, and he's worked in South and West Africa, Central America, post-communist Europe, and more. Eric has expertise in conflict resolution and peace building, just two small skill sets, I would say. But today he spends his professional time working with some of the world's most creative business leaders and most generous philanthropists, helping them move their ideas all the way to implementation. He works on small challenges, things like climate change, pandemic disease, poverty, those simple little challenges that we face in our society. I'm not going to read his bio to you because I feel certain that you already have, but I will say that Eric served as the foreign policy advisor to President Bill Clinton and to the William J. Clinton Foundation. So Eric joins us today to talk about charitable giving and how, regardless of amount, we can have a greater impact in today's world. So Eric, welcome to Club 99.
Thank you.
I was hoping to welcome you back to the Clinton Presidential Library and to have dinner with you last night and visit, but alas, here you sit in Atlanta in an airport and I sit in Fort Smith, Arkansas.
Right.
Just grateful for today's technology, but we're going to make the best of it, and I'm going to count on you coming back to Little Rock on some sunny summer day. How does that sound?
That sounds perfect.
All right. I want to start, Eric, with your old stomping grounds. We would be in the Clinton Library today, and you've spent quite a bit of time there, and certainly with President Clinton, whom many of us know. So give us a little more depth on your work with President Clinton and how it led to what you do today.
Sure. Before jumping in, I just want to say thank you to a few people, obviously to you, Heather, for rolling with the weather and technology punches of the last 24 hours. And to my old friend, Denver Peacock, who I was lucky enough to have dinner with last night before I flew to the Delta Lounge in Atlanta. But the last thing I also kind of want to mark before, again, diving into an answer to that question, Heather, is I feel really privileged to be speaking to the Rotary Club of Little Rock. Just because in my experience, Rotary has long been a beacon of kind of community and international engagement. And particularly, we're in a moment that I think we'll discuss more later, but a moment of, among other things, kind of declining faith in institutions. And I feel that in that context, Rotary plays an even more important role in promoting citizen engagement. So it's exactly this type of dialogue with exactly this type of membership that I feel really honored to be speaking with. To answer your question more directly, though, Heather, I'd say the following. So as you mentioned, I had the great privilege of working with President Clinton from 2002 to 2007 after he left office. And I was actually the first hire at the Clinton Foundation who was not from politics. So when I came into the Clinton Foundation, my frame of reference was very much, how do you take this singular individual who at that time was probably either him or Nelson Mandela was the best known person on the planet. And how do you take his kind of unique creativity, networks, ability to marshal human and financial capital, and turn that into sort of world-changing impact? And so I went in knowing pretty close to nothing about politics, either upper or lowercase p politics. But I did know a little bit about how to get things done. And so for me, I entered with this incredible enthusiasm about how could we kind of point this sort of, potential at a whole bunch of big issues. And in that context, with the Clinton Foundation, I did a lot of work that were really some of, I think, the Clinton Foundation signature work around HIV and AIDS, around setting up the Clinton Global Initiative, which some of you might be familiar with, and around climate change and a number of other topics. And I really, really, really enjoyed kind of taking this potential, again, networks, capital, people, and figuring out how to pull that together to make a difference on issues that mattered. So that was basically the good fortune I had, was to work with President Clinton and dozens of other super talented people on the team at the Clinton Foundation to make this happen. And it was really through that work that I got to thinking, hey, I really, really enjoy this kind of building phase. And I enjoy this kind of turning around things that are underperforming, and really started to think about how I could make that the focus of what I was doing professionally. And so I ended up doing a fair bit of work in the private sector after I left the Clinton Foundation, also on kind of setting up new departments, new kind of product lines or service lines and principally in the kind of financial and investment industry. And that ultimately led to kind of what I'm doing right now, which is, as you mentioned, serving as an independent consultant, working with a lot of people that would either fall into the camp of sort of executive directors or board chairs or founders or entrepreneurs, but basically building kind of high trust relationships with those people and helping them, again, either move their ideas from the drawing board into implementation, or into helping them turn around kind of underperforming entities and all the kind of tough and fun and challenging decisions that come with that. And it's kind of in that context, I've really focused a lot in the last decade on philanthropy and on kind of much of the same terrain that you cover. What are the key issues? What are the key challenges? How do you work with communities, et cetera?
Eric, you've already mentioned several things I would love to chase, and we might come back to a few of them, but I'm going to stick with a few questions here to focus us. So you're in the consulting business, and you've told me that you work for both, for-profit, not-for-profit leaders. You work across all industries, really, and many different issue areas. You also work from the strategic point of view all the way to the nuts and bolts down to the operational level. So with all that landscape in mind, with your perspective, what are some of the key trends that you see in philanthropy today, and perhaps maybe some of the things that have changed while you've been working in this field?
Right. That's a potentially huge answer, so I'll count on you to interrupt me if I go on too long, which I have a unfortunate tendency to be a gas bag sometimes. So I'll do my best to keep it succinct. I also feel a little silly because I know you probably know more about the answer to this question than I do, Heather, but I appreciate you asking it. I think when I look at the landscape now and I think of kind of some of the big changes or some of the big buzzwords as well that are kind of swirling around the world of philanthropy, I think, a couple things I'd focus on. One, that sticks to mind is this kind of notion of the democratization of philanthropy. And I think that's a phrase that gets a lot of mileage, but it's worth unpacking. And because what's within it, I think, is a lot of really important developments for anyone who's, either giving money away or receiving that capital, and what are those kind of relationships. And so I want to dive into it a little bit, and I'd also encourage anyone who's listening. A colleague and I, Aaron Reed, and I wrote a couple articles last year that pick up some of the strands I'm about to mention. They're available on worth.com. But some of the key points we really focused on were, if the holy grail of philanthropy is having an impact, having a positive impact, of course, you inevitably are then talking about questions of accountability and effectiveness. How do we know what we're doing is good, and how can we make it better? Put very simplistically. And that's in part what I think drives people to this question of democratizing philanthropy. What can we do to ensure the greatest possible positive impact, the most enduring positive impact? And Aaron and I had kind of thrown out in one of our articles this idea of community-centered philanthropy as a way of sort of both democratizing philanthropy, but also, again, at the end of the day, we're all in the impact business, those of us who are working in philanthropy. And when we talk about community-centered philanthropy, I think we talk about kind of three things. So we talk about transparency, and by way of trends, again, I think these are trends that we're seeing increasingly in grant making. And specifically, how do you increase transparency between philanthropists, philanthropies, and the communities that they serve? And I think a huge part of that is the philanthropies being increasingly honest in their dialogue with communities about what's working, what's not working, what philanthropies know, and as crucially, what they don't know, which is a lot when you're talking about communities they work in as outsiders. And I think what's so crucial about increasing transparency and communication between grant makers and the communities they work with is that this sort of humility and sharing is what breeds trust. And that really brings me to kind of the second piece of what I consider as sort of linchpin for community-centered philanthropy. And trust. What does that practically look like? So I think trust at its core is saying, we, the grant makers, don't actually know what it looks like to be at the coalface of major issues in your communities, whatever that community is. And so we are going to defer to you when it comes to defining what success looks like. What does impact look like in your communities? And in order to do that, that's really breaking a decades-long model of grant makers saying, here's money, here's what you're going to use it for, and here's how we're going to know if it's successful. And moving away from that sounds very trivial because we do it in our daily lives. We build trusting relationships with friends and coworkers and our families, et cetera. But it's actually something that has proven very hard to break in the philanthropic community. And so I think trust, basically, and letting communities decide what success looks like, and even more progressively, to allow them to decide how to allocate the funds. Not having the grant maker say, you should use this money for these activities over this duration of time. That begets a virtuous circle. Trust begets better communication and two-way communication, where you create an environment where your grantees can say back to you, hey, this is what works for us. This is what doesn't work. This is what we know. This is what we don't know. And so I think initiating those types of relationships with grantees and communities is crucial. And the last thing I would say is, and this advances a little bit to kind of a to-do item, but in democratizing decision-making, there's one thing that's really simple that I see happening all over the place and just needs to continue, which is people are diversifying their boards to reflect the communities they work with, diversifying their staffs to do the same thing. And that's really the start of actually letting the kind of community let you know better what works and what doesn't work, and letting them make decisions about what will have the best impact in their communities. So sorry to be long-winded, but I think that those are kind of three really, there's a set of that trends that I'm lumping, however, incorrectly under democratizing philanthropy, that I think gets at a lot of what I see happening in the landscape today that's super encouraging. And also, I think will make a real difference in the long run in terms of solving some of the seemingly intractable problems we all work on.
Eric, you are speaking my language for sure. You know a little bit about our system at the Community Foundation, and we believe very much in local people making local decisions. That's been our #1 value system. We push most of our grant making out to local committees across the state to make those decisions, because we say, why should we sit in Little Rock and make a decision about what Marianna, Arkansas needs, or why should someone in Washington, D.C. dictate what should happen on the ground in Arkadelphia, Arkansas. And it works really, really well. There is a balance with that. And well, before I say that being local and really driving that down, I think does build trust. People trust people they know. And so working at a very grassroots community level sometimes is a lot easier on the trust factor, and maybe a little bit on the transparency factor. But then you also have to balance that sometimes with outside solutions, outside thanking, bringing in different things. And so that leads me to this next question. I think it may not tie in your mind, and you tell me if it doesn't, but in one of the articles that you just referenced in your worth.com articles, you talked about cognitive dissonance in addition to long-term thinking. And that's very interesting for those of us who've read it. So just spend a minute talking a little bit about those two, balancing them, and how that ties into building trust and transparency.
Yeah, I would love to. So I would say the following. One of the things, and I feel like we all deal with this, every last American and probably every last person on this planet these days, whether or not it's just how we perceive things or not, the world's a pretty complicated place. And right now, I would say, we live in exceptionally complex times, politically, economically, socially. And further, no matter where you are on a spectrum, and I'm one of these people who believes we actually in the United States still do have a spectrum of beliefs. It's not left and right or black and white or whatever it is, but wherever you kind of live on that spectrum, just as a citizen, let alone as a philanthropist, I think it can seem incredibly overwhelming right now to do the work we're doing. And I think it can also seem, frankly, at points kind of inconsequential. Are we making a difference? Is all the work that we're doing making a difference? And I think when I look at that context as sort of the macro context in which anyone is working as a philanthropist, I think, as you mentioned, kind of one of the only ways forward is to embrace the complexity and those contradictions and get comfortable with cognitive dissonance, right? Which I'll just define as, understanding and acting upon a set of paradoxical inputs and insights. But just acknowledging that the world is a complex and contradictory place, I think is an essential starting point for anyone who's engaged in philanthropy. I do think it ties into kind of the point you were making about trust, because what you have to do is start off as a person, whether you're a large scale or a small scale philanthropist, and maybe start from the point of saying, I don't actually know what's going on in community X. I don't know what's going on a particular issue. Be humble about it, but that shouldn't prevent you from engaging in it. And so when I look at it, I'd say you need to practice this cognitive dissonance, right? You need to acknowledge that we need to engage on a variety of urgent issues. You may not know more about it. So what that is going to require you to do is bring in all the stakeholders and have faith that they know more than you. And at the same time, expect them to justifiably say, hey, I want to make sure that we're actually having an impact. One of the things I think that often gets thrown into this idea of building trust and working with communities is that there will be no metrics, that there'll be no accountability. That's not the case at all. What we're saying is work with communities to define what success looks like. So going back to the point I was making and that you had raised about this cognitive dissonance, in the face of probably complex problems, in the face of a very polarized political world we live in the case of economic volatility that we've seen in the last year, I think it requires one to act in this dissonant fashion, which is that one needs to be ferociously patient, for example. So at the same time that you are approaching an issue with the urgency it demands, whether it's climate change or economic inequality, whatever the issue is, you need to be patient about how long the results are going to take. And so I think another kind of dissonance that you need to cope with as a philanthropist today is to be pragmatic about what's possible, but also somewhat immodest in your expectations in the long run. And because I don't think without that kind of patient impatience, if that makes any sense, you're actually going to see any kind of progress. And I think the last thing I would probably say with respect to the cognitive dissonant moment that we live in is that it's really led me to believe that hope is a long game. And so that, I'd written that basically evidence-based optimism, which is wedded to patience and persistence, is in fact not a failure of belief. It's an incredibly smart way in my mind to kind of reconcile the realities of the complex world we live in, the uncertainty we live with, and the practical limits of our ability to affect change with the overall philanthropic imperative, which we discussed, which is having an impact.
Eric, I think, people are probably thinking right now, gosh, philanthropy is a lot more complicated than I thought. I just want to write a check, and I want to make an impact. And you can still do that, of course. I mean, there are so many good nonprofits out there that you can simply do that. But the scale you're talking about, sometimes it's hard for those of us who are, relatively small philanthropists to feel like they can engage at that level, and so I'm just kind of curious in your work, does that, how do you overcome that? Or do you just work with people really who are thinking that big and on those big issues? Or do you work with a person who walks in your door and, says, I just want to do something good, and, they want to feed a hungry person, how do you bridge that?
Well, I think the short answer is both. I mean, it also, I think the real limitation is less the scale of money that you're donating, and more the time that you have to actually kind of dig in and do the research on who you're giving to. And I don't think, and I think that's a question, frankly, in my experience that, my neighbors who are philanthropists experience, and some of the super high net worth individuals I work with experience as well. And I would say further, I don't think there's any shame in not being able to carve out the time to do that kind of research. I think, frankly, that's why community foundations exist. That's why great intermediary organizations exist. Where it gets tricky, I think, is to me, it's a little like voting in the following way, right? I think if you vote, you should take the time to research the candidates. And if you are then surprised by what that candidate does when she or he is in office, you're licensed, you're right. You've got a right to be surprised. You got a right to be disappointed. You've got a right to be elated. But I think if you don't put the time in and then you complain about it, that's probably just on a human level, not super helpful. So a lot of how I engage sometimes is going through an education process with new grant makers or grant makers who are around who have been disappointed with the impact that they have. And maybe they've come into new money and they really have decided they're at a stage in their life that they want to go from being passively engaged in philanthropy and charity to being more engaged. But I do think the quality of problem you outlined is the same regardless of scale. And the answer, for better or worse, because we're all busy people, is put some time in to kind of learn the issue, learn the organizations in your community. And if you can't do that, give to people like Heather Larkin.
Well, I appreciate that plug because community foundations are working in that arena. And I love your voting analogy too. Take the time to know where you're putting your money.
Right.
And you can do pretty simple research. It doesn't have to be really, really in depth, but
Exactly.
just know where you're putting your money and do a little homework. Well, let's go back to accountability a little bit and in your work, I'm sure you've heard this phrase. I know you have because we've talked about it. I've heard it. I've even said it. We want our nonprofits to be accountable. They should be run like businesses. They should have a business mindset. And there's some good and bad about that. So talk to us a little bit about accountability and what it means to apply a business mindset to philanthropic work, nonprofit work.
Yeah, see, I think this is a super interesting question because I think it's one of those ones where many of us have a strong opinion without knowing we have a strong opinion about it. And in your last question, in response to your last question, I'd mentioned that it's important to kind of do the work and assess organizations and assess the work that they're doing. And one of the kind of mindsets that we bring to that assessment, quite often, many of my clients are successful business people who have made their own fortunes and are now looking to very intentionally and very thoughtfully give that money away. But necessarily a bias they bring to it is looking at grantees or organizations as businesses. How much does it track with what they know about businesses, for example? And I think this has virtues and pitfalls, like so many things. And so I would say a good organization is definitely a good organization, regardless of whether it is philanthropic or profit driven. So you can tell by looking at organization whether it's well managed or poorly managed. And so I believe in some cases, absolutely, this notion of reviewing nonprofit organizations like businesses makes sense. Do they hire people based on competence and their understanding or experience with a particular issue or a community or customer? That really is important for and nonprofit organizations. Do they provide adequate resources to the financial management function of the organization? Again, a good nonprofit should look very similar, maybe not the same scale, but should look very similar to a good for-profit in that respect. And similarly, when you look at an organization's bylaws and things like that, are they enshrining transparency and evidence-based decision-making in their processes, in the organization at its core? I would want that from companies I invested in, as well as nonprofits that I donated to. I think where it gets tricky, and maybe one thing that's kind of straddles it and is the pivot to my saying a little bit of what I think are the downsides of applying a business model to nonprofits. One of the things that I think it's also really important to do, and some, I would say some of the progressive funders I know are really bad at this, is also to acknowledge that there might be instances when how a nonprofit operates is actually on an issue that's best solved by a market-based approach. I, for example, sit on the board of an organization called Accesso, which was co-founded by President Clinton and an independent philanthropist named Frank Giustra. And what they basically believed was, if you can connect poor farmers in Latin America to local, regional, and international markets, and more effectively get rid of middlemen, get rid of predatory intermediaries, help them know what the market demand is and meet the market demand, not just grow more of what they already grow, that this would increase their incomes, and that would then address things like education, health, etc. And to me, that's a great use of a market mentality. If people bring more capital home, more often than not, they want to spend it on health and education and other kind of vital needs for them or their children. Where the analog, or where the kind of metaphor of running like a business in terms of nonprofits runs into its limitations, to me, is basically the culture of effective philanthropy is different a little bit from the culture of effective business. The problems that we operate on are qualitatively different. Climate change is a many-headed beast that has social repercussions, that has justice repercussions, that has technical, scientific, economic, etc. So while Tesla can help us with a cleaner future, Tesla can't adjust for the fact that certain communities are kind of green energy deserts, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think where things get tricky is basically in that I think the mentality of kind of short-termism or a quarterly results mindset that prevails understandably a lot of the business world doesn't capture the intrinsically complex long-termist nature of a bunch of the problems that philanthropies look to address. So putting it more simplistically, the bottom line in business is not the same as the bottom line in philanthropy. In business, we're usually talking about dollars and cents. In philanthropy and in nonprofit work, we're often talking about human lives. And so a lot of the progress can be measured in dollars and cents, but not all of it. And maybe the last thing I'd say, which touches on a question that you raised earlier, is that top-down solutions sometimes work in business, but they rarely work in the kind of philanthropic or nonprofit sector.
Yeah, very much agree on that. There's a nonprofit needs to be run not by part-time volunteer. There has to be some accountability for leadership and professionalism, but the challenges are different. So I want to change direction just a little bit and talk about what I'll call the generational divide. How we see philanthropy, how we see solution building based on our generational cohort. And I know that many in Rotary see it in their offices and in business, and we certainly see it in philanthropy, just working across generations. We at the Community Foundation, of course, we're working with families, oftentimes a matriarch and a patriarch that have built wealth. They are now in their 70s or 80s. They've done their philanthropy. They're transitioning it to not the next generation, although that goes pretty easy. Where we're seeing really interesting conversations is when they're transitioning it to the third and fourth generation, the grandkids and the great grandkids, because their view of wealth is different. Certainly their view of how to tackle challenges is different. The issues that they are interested in are different, and how they want to talk about them. And so sitting at those tables with those families, really an interesting experience. So I want to hear from you on that. You're working in these businesses, you're working with families. I assume you're doing some generational cohort work. How do you bridge it? And what do you see as philanthropy moves, as the wealth and problem solving move from?
So I'm going to give it the kind of worst type of answer, I'm sure, which is a mix of observations with precious few conclusions, because I think you can really, commenting broadly upon Generation Z or millennials is kind of a little bit of a sucker's game, and one that I'm probably not informed enough to engage in, but I would say the following. I mean, you pretty much nailed it. I mean, in the work that I've done with kind of multi-generational families that are engaged in philanthropy, I do think it's kind of axiomatic that each generation has its own different value set that it brings to that, and issues that it deems kind of more important, and that in some families this can become a catalyst for actual, sort of disagreement or worse. But I do think that if done right, and this is one of these things, I guess I don't think philanthropy is rocket science. I think a lot of it's just people and applying the same kind of ideas you'd apply to working with different kinds of people to your philanthropy. But I've seen a number of instances where in fact, philanthropy has been used as a way of kind of bridging sort of latent generational divides in families. And it's sort of, if the younger generation is not yet interested in the family business, whatever they might be, they're often much more interested in giving the money away in the family philanthropy. And the process of using that to understand, hey, this is why my mother or father think the way they do, or why my grandfather or grandmother think the way they do. It can be done, if managed well, it can be done in a way that actually enhances family understanding and drives family togetherness. But as with the kind of, the much written about kind of upheavals, I think, in the private sector, where we've seen I think a lot of examples of kind of, and again, like I said, I don't come to a conclusion. I don't know where I stand on remote working or some of these big things, but I will say this: there's no denying that issues like that are very important to a younger generation. Quality of life issues and values issues, again, are really important and rear their heads in 1,000 different ways in the workplace today. And so I'm struck by that. It is a force, this generational mindset, and the fact that, there's definitely a difference between my generation and Gen Z, really influences, is something that can be misplayed or handled as a way of increasing unity as well. So that's kind of one observation I'd make about it. The other thing I'd say that's just becoming kind of really apparent to me is that the younger generation has such a different relationship with money that I think that quite apart from the values distinctions, quite apart from the work and lifestyle distinctions, there's such a core disagreement about what role money has. And even I think we're going to see increasingly two things with respect to younger people. One is, I think, and again, I'd say this stretches across the partisan divide in the United States, more and more young people really are troubled about the state of the climate and the world that is being bequeathed to them. And so I think that will become an overarching, it's already prominent, but I think that will become an overarching focus of where capital goes to philanthropically and in the private sector, driven by this generation. And then I think there's a broader question of philanthropy itself that philanthropy has to answer, but that it will be prodded by this generation, which is, why do we have endowments? If there are needs now, why do people not allocate the money now? And I think there's an increasing core fire of voices basically saying, hey, this is actually money given to us by the US government, right? In that it's not taxed. Should we be spending that? What should it be used for? So I'm bringing that up as distinctively a money issue, because I think capital flows are questioned in a different way by the young and younger generations today than they were by mine, by yours, and by the last few generations.
Yeah. Boy, I wish we could have had dinner last night, Eric. Good conversation. So we've got just a few minutes left. I want to bring it back. This is big. Talking about philanthropy and really having an impact is big, and it's complicated, and there's lots of things there. So just thinking about all of us here in the virtual Zoom room, everybody, we're all Rotarians, and we all, want the world to be a better place. We have that in common. Another thing we have in common is that we've all in some shape, or form tried to be a part of positive change. And the third thing I'll say is that we've probably all experienced in that effort to be a part of positive change. You know, we've experienced the feeling that we've fallen short, that we haven't really had that impact. So, you know, what are a couple of things, 2 or 3 things that you think any of us can do, regardless of the amount of money that are deploying? What can we do to, you know, prevent that feeling of not making much of a difference, or, you know, even worse, just wasting our investment, our charitable investment?
So I think an answer to that question is sort of a lot about kind of how you frame the work you're funding and supporting and doing in your own right, and a little bit of kind of psychotherapy, to be perfectly honest. And you know, we've alluded to some of these strands earlier, but just picking out of my head, a kind of 2 or 3 things I would say. We should be attentive to the fact that there are often kind of interim impacts associated with the work that we're supporting. And so I'll give you an example. I used to do a lot of work in Peru, and a lot of work on sort of trying that actually led up to this project Accesso that I mentioned earlier, but was an effort to sort of work with the government of Peru to provide more affordable, more efficient cataract surgeries to citizens in that country. And in high altitude countries, there's a massive, like much more massively greater prevalence of cataracts. So it's you know, much higher than the US. And most of the people who need cataract surgery live in very remote places and high in the mountains of the Andes. I bring this up because we tried for years to do a long project where we would revolutionize the way cataract surgeries were done in the entire country. And in the process of doing that, we realized, wow, a few things. Like A, we weren't the right people to be doing this. And B, the government of Peru was immensely difficult to work with for reasons I won't get into. At the end of that, we were essentially looking at that as a failure until we realized that in the process of doing all this learning, we'd given 50,000 people cataract surgeries. And I remember thinking, like, was it a failure? Okay, it wasn't a grand strategic victory, but it was successful. We frankly altered the lives of 50,000 people. So I think it requires a little bit of perspective and standing back. And as long as you're not doing harm, maybe the positive isn't as positive or as massive as you want it to be, but it's worth, without sort of lying to yourself, it's worth thinking that way. Another thing I would say that is often the kind of residue of an effort that maybe doesn't go as well as you intended, but is worth thinking about, and honestly should be built in almost all the work we do, even if it's at a small scale, which is the importance of empowering the next generation of leaders in your community. And so I would say, for example, you know, I've done a lot of work in climate change over the years. I am startled by how vital and vibrant the number of teenagers in the United States who are engaged as activists in this issue are now. And so even if our efforts to date have failed to make this a widespread concern that gets people elected, I am heartened by the fact that there are a generation of young leaders, people of color, girls and women, as well as sort of the typical profile, who work on this stuff all day and are incredibly intense about it and will be tomorrow's leaders in terms of finding solutions. And so I content myself and I make sure that everything I'm supporting and doing, at a minimum, will expose a next generation of leaders to new ways of doing things, new ways of running things, and expose this old white guy to the same kind of thing. So those are 2 things that kind of immediately spring to mind.
I think that's good. I'm so relieved and glad that you finished with the last one, because it basically, what I heard is that for those of us who want to work on world hunger, then yes, that is something we need to do. But for those of us who want to feed hungry people in Little Rock, that is worthy too.
Yes.
And so bringing it all together, research those organizations, find what speaks to you, and support it at whatever level. So,
100%
all right, we've
agree.
got just about 2, maybe 3 minutes. I see Denver's looking at me. I want to see any questions that we have for Eric. Let me get into my chat. All right, Denver, you want me to
Yeah,
go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay, so Sue Owens, who ran a nonprofit, a fabulous nonprofit for a long time. She's very grateful for you being here, Eric, and loves the program. She talks about how she and her husband give to organizations that have impacted their lives personally. I guess that's one of their filters, and that they feel passionate about. And she asked, is there research that we know of on how passion for a cause impacts how we give to that cause? Passion impacting giving.
So I think there's research, and I'll see if I can dig it up and feed it back through Denver, but there's a fair bit of research that shows something that I think is self-evident, which is the more a issue or community aligns with your passions and your upbringing and your experience and things like that, the more that's kind of the sweet spot if an organization can align with your passions. So somewhat self-evidently, things you're passionate about get more of yours and other people's money. What is kind of tracked separately, though, is whether or not those are effective organizations, right? And I think that's one of the things that's tricky is, right, we want to be engaged in organizations and causes we give to. I think that's a crucial part of it. You shouldn't give to something that you don't feel a link on a personal level to. But where it gets tricky is if there are 10 organizations doing it, what's the right one? And how are you making that decision? So I think I'm a big believer that passion has to be a part of successful giving and satisfying giving. But I don't think it necessarily correlates with the performance of the organization you give to. Sorry, that's a little bit of a clinical answer, but I think that's probably the right answer.
That's good. That's good. So, all right. Well, it's 12:59 by my clock in Denver. On the agenda, it says turn it back over to you. So it's all
Well,
yours.
thank you guys. If there's another question out there, we'd love to hear from you. The good thing about Zoom is people can leave when they want to. So unlike the meeting in person, you have to walk out discreetly and all that. So if people do want to stick around and ask questions, I think we'd be certainly welcome. I'm sure Eric would welcome that. He's got a few more hours layover in Atlanta, if I understand the schedule correctly.
Yes.
But again, we just want to say thank you, Eric. I've been a friend of Eric's for many, many years, and we've traveled to a lot of far-flung places and had a lot of international travels together with President Clinton, and we just always had a great time. I think I saw Tyler Denton, our friend from DC now, was on earlier, and Micah's husband, Greg Hale, and others he's gotten to know over the years. So, of course, the folks here in Little Rock. But anyway, we're grateful for you, Eric. You've been a longtime friend and one of the people I've always enjoyed the most about when I was doing advance for President Clinton. So grateful to see you in Little Rock briefly, and glad to hear you're going to make it
Next
home.
visit will be
safely.
longer, I promise.
Yeah.
I promise.
We do have Illuminate the Rock gifts for our speakers this year, Eric. I don't have the copy with me. We will put it in the mail to you.
Okay.
It's part of a series of gifts we're giving to our speakers by Little Rock Connected authors. And it's going to be a selection of those books we'll be giving to all of our area Little Rock School District resource centers and libraries in the name of all of our speakers for the year. And so your name will be included among those.
Great.
We do have an Arkansas Traveler Certificate that's coming. Apparently the governor hasn't signed the form yet, so we're going to get those as soon as we get them, and we'll put that in the mail to you as well. So we're excited to say thank you for being a part of our world this week. We appreciate the modern technology and allowing Heather to be in Fort Smith with her mother, and with Eric to be in Atlanta, flying back home to be with his wife and daughter. And again, I just want to say thank you for being a part of today's Rotary program. Next week, we will have Forward Arkansas's Education in Arkansas release. It's their new dynamic report about the state of education in our state. Please don't miss it. It's going to be phenomenal, and they have agreed to release it at Club 99. So I'll say this again to all our PR peeps in the club, and we have a bunch of them. Please consider Club 99 as a forum to release your information. We want to know about that and have an opportunity to share it with our great membership. Again, I will say thank you to Eric and Heather. I think folks want to stick around, feel free to do that. But if we've got a bell, Jake, let's ring it. We are adjourned.
So, Eric, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name's Ed Levy. I'm a Rotary member. Do you need to rush off?
No, I'm happy to stick around as long as everybody else can.
So I've been involved in a lot of charitable giving over the decades, Boys and Girls Club. Right now I'm supporting Life Skills for Youth, which is similar to the Boys and Girls Club. And lots of mission stuff, you know, reaching the deaf with the gospel, all kinds of interesting things there. Doing things here in Little Rock. But also another interesting thing I've gotten involved in is trying to create a Trail of Tears National Museum here in Arkansas. And the giving amount, if you can't, just the building is expensive, but if you include an endowment to run the facility, you know, we're looking at $250,000 I've got to raise. And, you know, that's a big number. And then on top of that, it's not something that's solving a problem. It's not like I'm helping, you know, disadvantaged children succeed in life, like Life Skills for Youth is, and giving them a chance at a life versus death or prison by 20, which is a real common outcome for the children that we're working with in that